Frozen fists pounded on the door in the middle of a blizzard, and what waited on the other side would change everything Caleb Voss thought he knew about his own frozen heart, a woman he would come to marry before that winter ended. He came off the cot with his revolver in hand because trouble didn't usually knock. She fell against the frame rather than into the room. One hand clawed into the wood siding, the other pressed flat over her ribs like she was holding something inside that wanted out. Elk-skin dress gone stiff with ice. Black hair, crusted white at the temples, her eyes found his face and held there, dark and unclouded, even while the rest of her swayed on legs that had carried her farther than they should have been able to. One word left her in a language he didn't know. Then, in English, scraped thin and careful. Snow, no more. Her knees went. He caught her before the porch boards did, the almost nothing weight of her, the cold coming off her skin like she was already something the winter had claimed, plainer than any doctor's word could have been. 10 more minutes out there, and he'd have found a body in the morning instead of a woman. What started that night on the Chama would not stay a simple rescue. A ranch gone quiet, since Caleb buried his brother, would fill up again with another person's voice, another person's hands moving through his kitchen, and the wariness between a Jicarilla woman running from men who claimed to own her, and a rancher who'd sworn off trusting anyone would bend, slow, into something neither of them had agreed to feel. It would be tested when riders came up the river road with a bill of sale and guns to back it. This is Caleb Voss in Nayeli, New Mexico territory, the winter of 1881, and what one closed door nearly cost them both. Watch this story to the end. If it holds you, like it, subscribe, and let's go back to where the snow started falling. The winter of 1881 had come down on the Rio Chama country like it meant to bury the whole territory and start over. By the second week of January, the pines above Jicarilla wore 6 weeks of snowpack. The ditches had locked solid, and the only sound most nights was wind working the eaves and the stove ticking as it cooled. Caleb Voss had built his spread on a bench of land above the river because his brother Thomas had liked the way you could see 3 ridge lines from the porch without turning your head. That had been 6 years back. Thomas was 2 winters gone now, thrown from a green horse in a hailstorm and dead before Caleb reached him across the pasture. Caleb did not talk about that. He had learned early that talking about it only sharpened the edges of the thing. What he had left was 400 acres of high grazing land, 60 head of cattle he was fighting to keep alive through the deep months, a rangy yellow dog named Mule who slept against the stove leg, and a silence in the house that had gotten so total he sometimes spoke to the dog just to hear a voice, even his own. He was 34 years old, and most mornings he could almost convince himself the ranch alone was enough. He worked from dark to dark, breaking ice on the stock tank before sunup, forking hay into drifts the cattle could reach, riding the fence line nearest the timber where elk pushed through when the high country iced over. He ate whatever was fastest to make and did not taste much of it. Neighbors down toward Los Ojos had stopped asking him to Sunday supper 2 winters back, not out of unkindness, but because a man says no enough times and people quit offering. Caleb hadn't minded, or had made himself believe as much. Caleb had grown up east of there in the Missouri Hill country, in a house where his father raised him on the notion that a debt unpaid was a debt that followed a man into his grave, and a kindness unreturned worked the same way, just slower and quieter about it. His father had not lived to see the ranch built. Neither had his mother. Dead of a lung fever the year Caleb turned 19. By the time Thomas talked him into New Mexico territory and the promise of open grazing land no one back home could touch, it had been the 2 of them against whatever came, brothers first and everything else after. Thomas had been the one with the easy laugh, the one who could talk a skittish colt into a saddle or a wary neighbor into a fair price. Caleb had been the one who did the books and mended the fence, and made sure the laughing didn't run the ranch into the ground. It had worked. That split. 6 years of it had worked well enough that Caleb sometimes forgot to be afraid of how much of his life was riding on one other person's good health. Then the hailstorm came through in June, and a green horse Thomas had no business riding without help, went sideways in the noise and the ice pelting down, and by the time Caleb reached the far pasture, his brother was already still in the wet grass, his neck broken quick, according to the doctor from Los Ojos, small mercy that it was. Caleb had buried him on the rise above the house where you could see all 3 ridge lines, same as the porch, because it seemed like the kind of ground Thomas would have picked for himself if anyone had thought to ask him in advance. He had not cried where anyone could see it. He was not sure, some nights, that he had properly cried at all, only gone quiet in a way that had never quite lifted. The night the woman came, the temperature had dropped hard right after sundown, the kind of cold that made the timbers of the house pop like something inside them was cracking. Caleb had come in from a late check on the cattle half frozen himself, banked the fire high, and settled onto the cot with a week-old Santa Fe paper he wasn't really reading. The wind had been building since noon, and by 9 it hit the ridge full force, a wall of white that swallowed the barn from the house windows entire. Mule had wedged himself under the stove and gone still. Caleb had read the same paragraph 4 times when the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate strikes, not panic. Something more like a person spending her last strength with care, making sure it counted. She had been walking since before dawn. Her name was Nayeli, and in the tongue of her people, the Jicarilla Apache, it carried the meaning of, I love you, a name her mother had given her, because she'd been the child born after 2 who had not lived, and her mother had wanted the first word spoken over her to be that one. Nayeli was 23. She had covered better than 30 miles on foot since the gray light of morning, through drifts that swallowed her to the thigh, wearing elk skin and moccasins sewn double-soled by her aunt for exactly this kind of country, though not for this kind of distance. She had left because staying had stopped being a choice. Her people wintered in the pinyon breaks below the mesa west of the Chama, sheltered ground they'd used for generations, and that autumn, a horse trader and sometime land agent named Dutch Merrow had ridden into camp with a wagon of goods, a smile that didn't sit right on his face. The paper claimed, to her father's brother, the headman of their small winter camp that season, that Nayeli would go with Merrow, promised in marriage, her uncle's mark already inked onto the page. Her uncle had made no such mark. Unable to read the English words himself, he'd been shown the document and asked to agree to something he could not verify, and Merrow had pressed a thumbprint onto it and called the matter settled. 5 riders backed him, along with a piece of tin he wore as a deputized agent's badge. Real or not, there was no telling, and her uncle understood there was no fight to be won that week, only time to be bought. Her uncle came to her wickiup before light, ducking under the low doorway with snow already caught in his hair. Go north, was the whole of it. Cross the Chama before the ice softens near the fords. Find high ground, where 5 armed men will think twice about following in a storm like the one building on the peaks. She had taken dried meat wrapped in yucca leaf, a wool trade blanket, a bone-handled knife that had been her father's before a Mexican trader's fever took him 3 winters back, and a small skin pouch of ground juniper and sage her mother had left her, and she had gone into the dark without waking the rest of the camp. Because goodbyes taken slow were goodbyes that gave Merrow's riders time to notice her missing before she'd put real distance behind her. She had grown up on stories of her grandmother's generation, the hard years when the Jicarilla bands had been pushed off the good river bottoms again and again by men with paper claims and government seals, and she had promised herself young that she would not be a woman such stories were told about, not without a fight in it somewhere. Running from Merrow did not feel like a fight. It felt, for 2 brutal days in the snow, like the opposite of one. Walking, she worked at convincing herself that a retreat chosen with clear eyes was not the same thing as surrender, that her uncle's counsel had been strategy and not defeat, and by the second night, she half believed it. By the second day, she had lost feeling in 3 of her toes, and knew it. She smelled wood smoke on a gust of wind, and turned toward it the way anything alive turns toward warmth, because there was no longer a choice in it, only the smoke and the cold and her own body's insistence on finding the one and outrunning the other. She had not come to beg. She had come, as much as her frozen throat would allow, to bargain. When the door opened and the lamplight hit her, she gathered the English she had, schooled Spanish and a trader's scraps of English, patched together from years of her people dealing with both, and gave him the only 2 words she had strength for. Then her legs quit on her, and the rest was his hands, and the floor coming up fast, and then the warmth of a hearth she hadn't built and didn't yet trust. Caleb laid her on the braided rug nearest the stove and got the kettle going, without much thought to what he was doing, only that a person that cold needed heat that didn't come too fast. He mixed the hot water with a splash of whiskey from the shelf, enough to start her blood moving without shocking a heart that might not take the shock. He knelt and checked her hands first, the fingers red and cracked, but not marbled white with the deep frostbite that meant losing them. Her feet were worse. He pulled her moccasins off and found blistered skin split open at both heels, and the 3 toes on her left foot, gone, the pale, waxy color that worried him most. He wrapped her feet in wool from the chest at the end of the cot, built the fire up past what the wood pile could really spare that week, and sat back on his heels to watch her breathe. Mule had crept out from under the stove and lay pressed against her side without being invited, which was more trust than the dog had shown most humans who came through that door. Caleb included some mornings. She didn't wake fully that night. She surfaced enough twice to accept water he held to her mouth, and both times her eyes found his face first before anything else in the room, steady, even half-conscious, like she was cataloging whether he was a danger before she let herself go back under. Caleb sat in the chair across from the hearth until near dawn, rifle across his knees, watching a stranger breathe in his house and turning over, without much success, what he was going to do about it. She woke before he expected, gray light barely up, and he came down from checking the loft to find her sitting upright near the stove, a cup in her wrapped hands, having apparently found the coffee tin and worked out the kettle herself. She had folded the wool blanket into a neat square beside her. She watched him come down the ladder with the same unhurried steadiness she'd shown collapsing on his porch. "Morning," he offered, because he didn't know what else to open with. She considered the word a moment, like she was turning it over for splinters. "Morning," came back even and careful. Neither of them moved for a stretch that felt longer than it was. Then she set the cup down. "Nayeli, Jicarilla. My people winter below the mesa." A pause, words chosen with visible care. "I cook. I know medicine, plants from this country, and my own. I will work for you every day until the road's open, for food and this floor to sleep on." It was the longest run of English he'd heard from her, and he could tell the careful accounting of her own usefulness had cost her something to say. Plain like that to a stranger, at gunpoint of circumstance, if not of an actual weapon. Caleb poured his own coffee from the pot she'd apparently already primed and sat down across the table, the revolver still on his hip, but his hand nowhere near it. "There's men looking for you. Not a question." Her face didn't change. "Yes." "How do you know this? You wouldn't have run through that storm for nothing." He turned the cup once in his hands. "How many, and how far behind?" "A man named Mero. Riders, maybe 5. "I do not know how far. I outran the worst of the snow, not the men." Her eyes stayed level on his. "If they come here for me, I will be gone before they arrive. I did not come to bring trouble to your door. You didn't bring the storm either, and it came anyway." He looked at her a long moment. "You stay till your feet heal. We'll talk about the rest of it when there's a rest of it to talk about." His hand had drifted to the revolver on his hip, without his noticing, an old habit from a territory that made a man careful around strangers of any kind, and he caught himself doing it only when her eyes dropped to it and back up to his face, not with fear exactly, more with the flat, weary recognition of someone who had watched that particular gesture play out before and knew every shape it could take. He made himself move his hand away, slow, deliberate, so she'd see it was a choice and not an accident. It was a small thing. It did not feel small to either of them. Watching him do it, she let the moment sit a beat before answering. I've had guns pointed at me by better men than Marrow. For less reason than a stranger has to be careful in her own house. This isn't your house yet. He heard how it landed the moment it left him and wished it different. No heat in it. Not yet. The first days were careful ones on both sides. Caleb gave her the small room off the kitchen that had been a tack-mending room since before Thomas died, and nothing much since, a cot, a nail on the wall, a window that looked out on buried pasture. Nayeli did not wander past rooms she hadn't been shown, did not touch what hadn't been offered, and worked, from first light without being asked twice, sweeping, mending a tear in Caleb's coat that had sat over a chairback for a month, keeping the fire fed while his hands were full outside. She moved through his kitchen with an economy he noticed and didn't mention. There had been no woman's hand in that kitchen since his mother passed years before. Thomas ever built the stove bench, only his own 2 hands doing everything alone for 2 winters running, and he caught himself comparing the quiet efficiency of her work to nothing at all, because there was nothing to compare it to. That was its own kind of strange. Mule adopted her within 3 days, which Caleb noted with more suspicion of his own reaction than of the dog's judgment. By the end of the first week, the cabin smelled different. Nayeli cooked with dried herbs from a small bundle she'd carried the whole 30 miles inside her blanket roll. Juniper berries, wild mint, a root she called by a name he couldn't repeat and translated loosely as sweet under snow. The first stew she made had dried venison and something bitter sharp he couldn't place, and he ate 2 bowls without meaning to and without much conversation, which was its own kind of comfortable. Thomas came to mind more than Caleb expected that week, not the fact of his death, but the ordinary shape of him alive. The way a third set of footsteps in the house dragged old grief up sideways from wherever Caleb had thought he buried it for good. On the 4th day, the wind and snow finally slacked enough that Caleb could get out past the barn, and he found Nayeli at the edge of the tree line that evening with a bundle of pine tips and something gray-green she'd dug from beneath an overhang where the snow hadn't reached. She was making a tea, she explained in her careful assembling English, for the cough that had started rattling in her own chest from the cold she'd taken on the trail. She drank it herself that night, grimacing at the taste, and by the 2nd night the rattle had eased. Caleb watched all this with the wary attention of a man cataloging a stranger's habits for danger, and finding instead competence. She never moved through his house like she owned any piece of it. She also never moved through it like she was afraid of it, which struck him as its own kind of dignity, one he hadn't seen up close before. By the 2nd week her feet had healed enough to bear real weight, and she began following him out to the barn mornings, wrapped in his spare coat over her own mended dress, watching him work the way a person watches to learn rather than to judge. She had questions about the cattle, blunt and practical. Why he kept them on this bench instead of the lower meadow, why the fence ran where it ran instead of following the creek, and he found himself explaining things out loud he'd only ever half worked out in his own head. She had an eye for ground that put his own to shame. Within a week, she'd shown him 2 low spots in the south pasture fence where drift would pile deep enough by February to let cattle simply walk out over the top of it, places he'd ridden past 100 times without seeing. Standing at the 2nd spot with his hands in his coat pockets, more curious than defensive about it, he had to ask, "How do you see that?" "My mother's mother taught the women of our band to read snow the way your people read a ledger book. Where it will drift, where the crust will hold a foot, and where it will not." It is not magic. It is only paying attention to something most men are too busy to notice. Feels like magic from where I'm standing. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. The first one he'd seen from her. Then you have not been standing here long enough. He put up brush and old fence rail at both low spots that same week, on her word alone, and did not regret it later. In the evenings, once supper was cleared and the fire built up for the night, they had fallen into a kind of unplanned routine. She mended what needed mending. He worked through the ranch accounts at the table, the ledger Thomas had always found tedious, and Caleb had inherited along with everything else. Some nights neither of them spoke for an hour at a stretch, and it had stopped sometime in that second week, feeling like anything other than comfortable. Without looking up from her sewing, she asked once what he did with all the silence before she came. He thought about lying, about something easier, and didn't. Not much. Sat with it. Talked to the dog some, which he never held against me. He turned a page of the ledger he wasn't really reading, same as that first newspaper the night she'd knocked. Wasn't good company for anybody, myself included. The dog thinks well of you regardless. Mule's easily bribed. Man learns not to put too much stock in a dog's good opinion. I have not been bribed a beat before, she added, and I do not think poorly of you either. She went back to her sewing before he could work out how to answer that, which he suspected was deliberate. There was a particular evening deep in the second week when she taught him his first real words in her language, not the scattered nouns he'd already picked up, snow and fire and dog, but a full short sentence, the kind a person says to another person and means. She made him repeat it 4 times before she was satisfied with the sounds, correcting the shape of his mouth with 2 fingers under his chin, like she was training a colt to hold a bit properly, entirely unbothered by how close that put her hands to his face, and entirely aware, he suspected, of exactly how unbothered she seemed. He got the sentence right on the 5th try. The translation, slow and eventual, came to something close to the fire holds, a thing spoken to a person, a household intended to keep welcome inside it. He thought about that sentence for days afterward, turning it over the way she'd turned over the word morning that first day, checking it for what it might actually mean underneath the plain shape of it. There was another evening, a hard one, when a letter came up from Los Ojos with the mail rider, from a neighbor named Pruitt, who farmed the bottomland 2 miles downriver and had never in 6 years bothered writing Caleb anything. The letter was polite in its wording and ugly in its meaning, wondering, in the careful language men use when they want deniability, whether Caleb understood what people in town were saying about an Indian woman kept up at his place, and whether it wouldn't be simpler for everyone, himself included, if arrangements were made elsewhere before talk turned into trouble neither of them wanted. Caleb read it twice at the table, jaw tight, and then fed it to the stove without comment. Nayeli had watched him do it from across the room, not asking what it said, though he suspected she guessed near enough. You do not have to protect me from knowing what people say. I have heard worse to my face, in towns with better manners than this one. Wasn't protecting you. A lie, and they both knew it was a lie, and neither one called it out loud. Then why burn it, instead of answering it? He considered the question longer than it probably deserved. Because Pruitt's wrong, and there wasn't a version of answering him that wouldn't have made me say something I'd regret needing to say out loud to a man like that. He looked at her. You're not an arrangement. Wasn't going to write back like you were one even to argue the point. She held his gaze a moment, something working behind her eyes that he couldn't fully read, and then nodded once, like he'd passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. She cooked that night with more of her own ingredients than usual, the sweet under snow root and dried choke cherries she'd been saving, and did not explain why, and he did not ask, and it was, without either of them naming it as such, the best meal either of them had eaten since the snow started falling that winter. Near the end of the second week, Caleb needed supplies badly enough that the trip to Tierra Amarilla could not wait for better weather, and against his own better judgment, he put it to her whether she'd want to come along rather than sit alone at the ranch with Pruitt's letter still fresh in both their minds. She considered it a long moment before agreeing. Mostly, he suspected, because she had spent 2 weeks confined to one small corner of the territory and had run out of patience for it. Town did not go easy on either of them. The general store's owner, a thin, careful man named Whitfield, who had sold Caleb feed and nails for 6 years without much conversation beyond the transaction itself, went quiet and watchful the moment Nayeli stepped through the door behind him, his eyes tracking her the way a man tracks something he expects to have to account for later. 2 women outside the milliner's stopped their conversation entirely as Caleb and Nayeli passed and did not start it again until they judged themselves out of earshot, which they were not. Nayeli walked through all of it with the same unhurried steadiness she carried everywhere, chin level, eyes forward, and if any of it touched her, she did not show it to the street. It was Caleb who felt his jaw tightening with every sideways look, every conversation that died and restarted a beat too late, quiet. Once they were back on the wagon with the supplies loaded, you don't have to hold it like that. The tightness in your shoulders. I have carried worse than a few unkind looks in a small town my whole life. It does not need your anger added to it. Maybe I want to give it anyway. Then give it somewhere. It will do good. Not to Whitfield's counter. Save it for a man like Merrow, who has earned it properly. Something in her face softened just slightly, an allowance she didn't often make. But I will say, it is not nothing, that you've felt it at all. Most men in your position would not have noticed the room go quiet. You noticed. Hard not to notice when it's happening to someone standing next to you. Many men manage it anyway, she left there, and he understood it for the compliment it plainly was, however carefully wrapped. On the ride back up the river road, with the wagon creaking over hard-packed snow and the light going long in gold across the white pasture, she wanted to know, unprompted, what he'd made of her people beyond what the territorial papers printed, which she'd read enough of by then to know was mostly fear dressed up as fact. Honestly, not much, he admitted. His father had raised him to distrust hating things a man hadn't bothered to understand, but understanding took effort. Most of his neighbors had never once made, himself included, until a woman half frozen had knocked on his door and left him no honest choice but to look closer. Unhurried, she laid out her grandmother's stories of the old camps in the Jicarilla homeland before the government pushed the bands onto smaller and smaller ground, the puberty ceremony held for a girl's first blood, 4 days of dancing and blessing that marked her as a woman of standing in the band, the way her people traced descent and property through the women's line rather than the men's, so that a Jicarilla woman owned her own household in a way white women rarely did in towns like Tierra Amarilla. The last part came with a particular dry precision, her eyes checking whether he understood what sat underneath the history lesson, and he did, and did not pretend otherwise. So when you came to my door offering to work for shelter, slowly working it through, that wasn't a woman with nothing to bargain with. That was a woman offering fair trade on her own terms. Yes. Satisfied, as if he'd finally caught up to a fact she'd known the whole time. I did not come to your door as a beggar, Caleb Voss. I came as a woman making the only bargain circumstance had left available to her. There is a difference, and I am glad you have found it. One night, mending by the fire, long after he'd have normally gone up to the loft, he found himself still sitting across from her, neither of them talking, and realized the quiet between them had stopped feeling like something that needed filling. Eventually, not looking up from the sock she was darning, "Your brother, you do not speak of him, but the house does. The chair by the window, the saddle in the barn, too small for your horse." Caleb looked at the fire a while, before answering. "Thomas, younger than me. A horse threw him 2 winters back. I was across the pasture. Didn't reach him in time. You blame yourself for a distance you could not close." Something like that, a long quiet, Then, my mother died 3 winters past, sickness that came through the camp in a bad season. I was 3 days right away trading with my aunt's people. I did not reach her either. Her eyes lifted to his. We carry the same stone then, different rivers. Something in that landed harder than he expected, and he didn't have a response ready, so he only nodded, and for the first time in 2 years, the silence in the house didn't feel like something Thomas had left behind. It felt like something 2 people were sitting inside of together. She set her darning down after a while and looked at the fire instead of at him, which he'd come to understand was how she gave a person room to speak without the pressure of being watched while they did it. After my mother died, I did not speak for the better part of a season, not from grief alone, from anger that the world had simply gone on as though nothing had changed in it. The birds still came back that spring. The camp still moved to summer ground. I remember being furious that the meadowlarks didn't know enough to stay quiet out of respect. Thomas's cattle didn't know either. Had 60 head to feed the week after the funeral. Couldn't spare a day to just sit with it, much as I wanted to. Did the work help, or only distract? He considered that honestly. The way he'd come to understand, she preferred a question answered. Bit of both, some days. Mostly distract. But distraction was nothing, that first year. Man needs somewhere to put his hands when the rest of him doesn't know what to do. Yes. Quiet. Certain. I understand that better than most things I have ever understood. They sat with that a while, the fire working down to coals, and when she finally rose to bank it for the night, her hand passed close enough to his shoulder, on the way that he felt the near touch of it for the better part of an hour after she'd gone to her room, turning it over the way he'd turned over her language lesson, checking it for a meaning he wasn't yet ready to name out loud. On the 12th night, Mule started barking at just past 2 in the morning, not his usual complaint at some elk crossing too near the fence, but a hard, urgent bark that had Caleb's boots on before his mind caught up to his body. He came down to find Nayeli already at the window, no lamp lit, watching the yard through frost-furred glass. Quiet, urgent, riders, coming up from the river road, 4, maybe 5. Their horses are blown. They've pushed hard through the snow to get here before light. You can see them from here. I can hear them, and I have watched that road for 12 days, waiting for this. She turned to him, the first time she'd used his given name. Caleb, they will not leave without trying to take me. Marrow does not stop for one failed attempt. Tell me what you want me to do, and I will do it. He pulled his coat on, checked the rifle. Stay inside. Bar the door behind me. No, plain. No heat in it. Only certainty. I know this ground better than any of them tonight. I have walked every drift and drainage on this bench since the storm broke, learning it because I knew this night was likely coming. Let me help you, or you fight this alone and lose more than you need to. He looked at her a long moment in the dark kitchen, and something in him, the same something that had kept him locking every door in this house against the world for 2 years, loosened just enough to let her words in. Tell me. There is a stand of aspen at the north fence line, where the ground drops fast toward the river bend. The crust there is rotten under new snow. I tested it 3 days back, walking the fence with Mule. If riders push horses hard across that shelf in the dark, not knowing the ground, they will not cross it clean. Her eyes held his. I can lead them there. You take the direct approach at the yard and hold Marrow's attention while I do. That's you walking. Straight-armed men in the dark. That is me walking ground. I know better than they do, in the dark, which is the only kind of advantage I have left to use. Her eyes didn't waver. I did not run 30 miles through a blizzard to be protected into a corner. Let me fight for this house, too. He didn't like it. He said so. She didn't argue the point twice, only waited, and eventually he nodded, because there wasn't time left to find a better plan, and because some part of him understood that refusing her, this would cost something he wasn't ready to name. Pulling his boots on fast in the dark, if this goes wrong, You get clear of the ranch entirely. Don't come back for me. Don't come back for the dog. You get to the Ute camps north of here, and you don't look back at this bench of land again, already at the back door. If this goes wrong, it will not be, because either of us failed to try. That is the only promise either of us gets to make tonight. One last look at him before slipping out into the dark. Ground holds a memory longer than men do. Caleb trusts the ground, and trusts that I know it. Then she was gone into the snow, and he had only the sound of Mule's low growl and his own heartbeat to keep him company on the walk to the front porch. She slipped out the back through the lean-to before the riders cleared the tree line, moving low along the fence line with a shadow's economy. Caleb walked out the front onto the porch, rifle low but ready, and let the lamp behind him throw his shape out into the yard, where Merrow's party couldn't miss it. The lead rider, a heavy-set man in a buffalo coat with frost thick in his beard, called out voice carrying hard in the cold, dead air. "Voss. Name's Merrow. I've got legal paper on a woman. I believe you're sheltering. Hand her over peaceable and we ride on. No trouble for you. Paper signed by a man who can't read the language it's written in isn't paper. It's a lie with a thumbprint on it. That's not your business to judge, rancher." Merrow's horse sidestepped, ice nervy. "I'd hate to have to search that house with force. You'd hate a lot of things you're fixing to try tonight." Caleb kept his eyes on Merrow, kept the man's attention pinned to the porch and away from the dark line of the north fence, where two of the riders had peeled off to flank wide through the trees, exactly as Nayeli had guessed they would. The two flanking riders pushed their horses out along the fence line at a trot, too fast for the dark, too fast for ground they'd never walked, straight onto the shelf of rotten crust Nayeli had marked 3 days before. The snow gave beneath the lead horse's front legs, with no warning, no crack, only a soft collapsing exhale, and the animal went down hard on its haunches, its rider thrown clear into a drift, the second horse rearing, and near unseating his own man in the sudden chaos of flailing hooves and cursing. Merrow's head snapped toward the sound. In the 3 seconds his attention broke, Caleb closed the distance between the porch and the nearest mounted rider, and pulled him from the saddle hard enough to end that man's part in the night's business early. By the time Merrow got his own spooked horse under control, one of his men was pinned under a downed animal cursing at the sky. Another was sitting stunned in a snowbank with a rifle he'd lost hold of, and Caleb had the third rider's own weapon leveled at Merrow's chest. Ground's not as friendly as you figured. Nayeli came around the barn corner a minute later, breathing hard from the run through deep snow, her knife still in hand, unbloodied. She hadn't needed it, only the ground itself had done what she'd asked of it. Merrow's eyes found her in the lamp spill from the house, and something ugly moved across his face. "You'll not make a fool of me twice, girl." Steady, unhurried, standing at Caleb's shoulder now, the way she'd once stood alone at his door. "I made no fool of you. You made a false paper and rode 30 miles into ground. You didn't trouble to learn first. That is a fool's error, and it belongs to you." Merrow looked between them, at the two men he had left upright, at the rifle in Caleb's hand, and made the calculation men like him always eventually made when the numbers stopped favoring their confidence. He wheeled his horse and rode, and after a moment's hesitation his last able rider followed, leaving the two who'd gone down in the snow to explain themselves. Caleb stood in the yard a long moment after the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the storm, rifle still loose in his hand, and looked at Nayeli standing in the lamp spill with snow melting in her hair, and her breath still coming hard from the climb. Something had shifted in him somewhere in the last 20 minutes that he didn't yet have words for, only the plain fact of it, solid as the ground she'd just brought down under Merrow's riders. You could have died up on that ridge, testing that crust in the dark alone with armed men riding straight at you. So could you, standing on this porch drawing Merrow's eye away from what I was doing. Her gaze held his, steady as she'd been every night since she collapsed against his door. We did not do this apart from each other tonight, only together. I would ask you to remember that part of it when you tell this story later. He had no answer ready for that either, and found, standing there in the cold with his heart still going hard, that he didn't much mind, not having one. Caleb walked the county line into Tierra Amarilla 3 days later, once the roads cleared enough to travel, and put the whole account in front of the territorial marshal along with the 2 men Merrow had left behind, who talked considerably more freely once their employer had abandoned them. The marshal, an unhurried man who'd heard Merrow's name attached to worse before, sent word south. Merrow did not come back up the Chama that winter, or any winter after. There was a hard night in early March, before the thaw properly started, when word reached them by way of a passing freight driver that a Ute trading party had come through the Piedra breaks and could carry word to Nayeli's people, if she wanted to send any, or carry her along with them, if she chose that instead. Caleb relayed the message plainly, without trying to shape it one way or the other, though it cost him more than he expected to keep his voice, even while he did it. Nayeli sat with the news a long while that evening, working it over the way she worked over everything, unhurried and thorough. She pressed the driver on detailed questions about the party's route, how many days to the winter camp, whether her uncle's name had come up and what he'd heard. She wrote nothing down. Papers had done her people little enough good, she remarked to Caleb later, and memory served better. But she turned the information over for the better part of an hour after the driver had gone back out into the cold to make his next stop. Caleb busied himself with the ledger that evening, not reading it, the way he hadn't really read that newspaper the night she arrived, and did not ask her what she'd decided, because some part of him understood that this was a choice she needed room to make without his hand anywhere near the scale. She found him still sitting there past midnight, the fire down to its last log, and set 2 cups of the tea she made. For evenings like this one, on the table between them before she sat back down across from him. Without preamble, I am not going with the traders. I wanted you to hear it plainly, not guess at it from my silence. Wasn't going to ask. Didn't think it was mine to ask. I know. That is part of why I am telling you without being asked. She wrapped both hands around her cup. My uncle is well. My people are wintering safely. I could go to them tomorrow with a clear conscience and no debt left unpaid to anyone. Her eyes lifted over the rising steam. I am choosing to stay a while longer instead, and I wanted you to understand. It is a choosing, not a habit I have fallen into because leaving felt harder than staying. Careful with it. Any particular reason for the choosing, or is that a question I'm not owed an answer to yet? The corner of her mouth moved, the almost smile he'd come to watch for. You are owed an answer. Eventually, not tonight. Tonight, I only wanted you to know the shape of the choice, so that when the answer does come, you understand it was considered and not sudden. He accepted that because he'd learned by then that pressing her past what she was ready to give only cost him ground he'd rather keep. But he slept easier that night than he had in longer than he could easily account for, and did not examine too closely why. Spring came to the high country the way it always did at that altitude, reluctant and gradual rather than sudden. The snowpack pulled back first from the south-facing slopes above the river. The ditches thawed and ran loud again. Meadowlarks returned to the lower pasture in late March, and Nayeli took to standing at the kitchen window most mornings to listen for them. The same unhurried stillness in her that Caleb had noticed that very first week and had come, slowly, to depend on without ever quite deciding to. She had stayed past the point where staying was necessary. Word had reached her again by way of the same Ute trading party passing back through on their return route that her people's winter camp had settled well for the season, and that her uncle sent word he was glad to hear she'd found solid ground. She had somewhere to go, still, whenever she chose it. She had made clear to Caleb, in her plain and unhurried way, that she was choosing to stay instead, and that the distinction between those two things mattered to her more than it might, to someone who had never had to make the choice at all. She had begun that spring riding the fence line with him some mornings instead of waiting at the house, not because he'd asked her to, but because she'd decided the ranch was as much her ground to know as her own people's breaks along the Piedra had once been, and she set about learning it with the same thoroughness she brought to reading snow. She found 2 more weak spots in the south fence he'd missed even after her earlier lesson, and a spring seat near the old line shack that would want draining before the summer cattle came up that high, and Caleb found himself, more mornings than not, simply riding alongside her and listening to what she'd noticed rather than leading the way himself. It occurred to him somewhere in March that he had stopped thinking of the ranch as a thing he alone was responsible for keeping alive, and started thinking of it as a thing the two of them were keeping alive together, and the shift had happened so gradually he could not name the day it occurred. In the evening she'd begun teaching him words of her language, the names for snow and fire and safe ground, and he found himself practicing them under his breath, while forking hay, clumsy and stubborn about it in a way that seemed to amuse her more than she let show. He taught her, in exchange, how to read the almanac and how to keep his ledger book, and she took to both with the same quick, unhurried competence she brought to everything else. One evening in April, the mud season between the last snow and real spring, with the light staying late, and the air carrying that particular sharpness that meant things were about to grow again, Caleb sat across the table from her after the supper dishes were cleared and found he'd been turning something over in his mind for the better part of 3 weeks. "I want to ask you something, and whatever you answer, nothing changes here. You've got a home on this ranch for as long as you want one, plain and simple, regardless." She waited, hands folded on the table, watching him with the same steadiness she'd carried since the night she collapsed on his porch. "I know you've got your people. I know you've got a whole life that was yours before that storm, and I'm not asking you to trade it away." He stopped, aware he wasn't managing this gracefully, and pushed forward anyway. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to stay here, not for shelter and work anymore, for something more than that." The evening light came through the window over the wash basin and caught the side of her face, and he thought, not for the first time, of what her name meant and how exactly it had come to fit. "I have watched you since that first morning. The way you are with a dog that trusts no one. The way you rode into town and told a marshal the whole truth of it instead of the easier version. The way you stepped back from your own doorway that first night so I would have room to decide for myself whether to trust you." She placed both hands flat on the table. "I know what you are asking me, and—" A quiet moment, and outside a meadowlark called down from the ridge, the same bird that had been finding its way back to that pasture every spring, Caleb could remember, back before the house had gone quiet, and now somehow after. "My people do not decide such things quickly, and I am my mother's daughter. I have never decided anything quickly in my life." Her eyes held his, steady as she'd been at his door in the worst storm of the winter. "But I have not left. Not once when I had every reason and every road open to me. That is my answer, if you know how to hear it." It was not a yes, and it was not a no. It was, he understood, something truer and more solid than either. The same bargain she'd offered him standing frozen on his porch, stripped down now to its plainest bones. "I am here. I am staying." He put his hand on the table close beside hers. Not over it, beside it, leaving the choice of the last inch to her. She looked down at his hand a long moment, then back up at him, and the corner of her mouth moved the way it did when something struck her as almost, but not quite, funny. She closed the last inch herself. The meadowlark called again from the ridge. The coals in the stove settled low and easy. And the house that had sat 2 winters in silence held the two of them now in a quiet that was no longer an absence of anything, but a fullness that had simply taken its time arriving. They were married that June in the yard between the house and the barn, under the same 3 ridgelands Thomas had once liked looking at from the porch without turning his head. Nayeli wore a dress, her aunt sent up from the Piedra Breaks by way of the same Ute traders who'd once carried word between her and her people. Elk hide worked soft and trimmed with beadwork in patterns that told, to anyone who knew how to read them, which band she came from and which family had raised her. Caleb wore his one good coat, brushed clean of 2 winters' dust, and stood in front of a circuit preacher out of Los Ojos, who'd ridden up specially, and who did not, to his credit, comment one way or the other on the bride, which Caleb counted as its own small mercy. Her uncle came down from the Piedra camp for it, 3 days hard riding with 2 of her cousins, and stood at the edge of the yard through the whole short ceremony with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read until afterward, when the older man shook his hand once, firm, and said in careful, accented English that he had worried what kind of man his niece had bargained with that first blizzard night and was satisfied now to have ridden down and seen for himself. It was not warmth exactly. It was something sturdier than warmth, the kind of judgment a careful man renders only after he has looked hard enough to trust it, and Caleb understood it for the considerable gift it was. Pruitt did not come, and did not write again either, and word eventually reached them that he'd sold his bottomland the following spring and moved on to Colorado, which Nayeli noted without much heat and Caleb without much regret. Mule slept against the stove leg still most nights, though he had taken in his old age to sleeping half the time against Nayeli's side of the hearth instead of Caleb's. A small betrayal Caleb pretended to mind, and did not in truth mind at all. In the years after, when neighbors who had once gone quiet on the street asked carefully how the 2 of them had come to be married, Caleb took to telling it plain and short that a woman had knocked on his door in the worst blizzard the San Juan country had seen in years. And that opening, it had turned out to be the only decision of his life he'd never once had cause to second guess. Nayeli, when she told it herself, told it a little differently, that she had come to that door with nowhere left to run, and had found, instead of an ending, a beginning she had not known to look for. Both versions were true. Neither needed the other to be complete, and together they made a story worth telling on a cold night, which is, in the end, the only kind of story that lasts. If this story found something in you, tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you longest. Subscribe if you want more stories like it, stories about the ones who found something worth keeping in the hardest, coldest places the frontier had to offer. We'll have another one waiting for you soon.